Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Thursday, the 2nd of February. On the module DD211. Knowledge is very important. Reading every day is very, very important. Keep your mind busy. It's the most important thing in life, reading to better your circumstances, to better your life chances. Education is everything. For youth, adults, keep your mind occupied, be methodical in approach. Anyway, on the module DD211, understanding politics, institutions, and ideas in the modern world. Make sure you reference your reading when you read. Also, it's important to record your reading. You can always listen to it back while you're relaxing. So we're on the chapter 20, Changing the State, Terrorism in Global Politics. Edward Wastonage and Simon Usherwood. One introduction, terrorism can be seen as one of the most pressing global issues of our time. You'll be able to pinpoint events within your lifetime or beyond that can be linked one way or another to terrorism. From the campaigns of the IRA in Northern Ireland and mainland Britain in the 20th century to the suicide bombing of Kabul airport in 2021. With the events of 11th of September known as 9/11 and the subsequent war on terrorism. The media, public debate and academic have been flooded with some studies and comment around this issue. Naturally, such a major event as 9/11, targeting as it did the world's preeminent military and economic power by attacking the symbolic targets of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, is bound to generate a substantive interest. But to the untrained eye, this could be considered something new. In the study of global politics, as Randall Law 2009, page 1, astutely observes, though, terrorism is as old as human civilization and as new as the morning's headlines. While methods and aims change, political violence has been around for as long as politics itself. Conventional forms of political violence at the hands of the states and empires can be seen in the myriad wars that have pockmarked human existence. Be they within states or between them, terrorism, however, is a far more slippery notion, despite its long history for a start. Despite the ism, what we are dealing with here is not an ideology, although certain groups may well have an ideological standpoint. While there are numerous definitions of what terrorism is, there is a broad agreement on its core feature, violence, however. From this starting point, definition becomes difficult as terrorist groups have widely divergent imperatives that may be liable to change over time. The term was initially The term was initially ascribed to the exercise of violence by the revolutionary government during a period of the French Revolution known as the Reign of Terror. Nowadays, the term is more commonly applied to a non-state group seeking political change, or in some cases, a change in the norms that govern the societies within. It should also be noted here states can also be accused of sponsoring terrorism and employing such statistics against their own other civilian populations. Terrorist groups can therefore be considered a type of non-state actor in global politics, and more specifically can be labelled as violent as armed and non-state actors who challenge the state's monopoly on violence through their own actions in seeking political change or gain. Page 232. Political violence is used by many different groups in global politics, although the focus here is on terrorism forming part of a wider collection of non-state actors. State-led political violence, sometimes defined as terrorism itself, is a regular feature of global politics. Israel campaigns against Hamas in the Palestinian territories in recent years are often painted as state terrorism by its opponents, while Israel would say it is defending itself against a terrorist threat. National liberation movements and guerrilla groups have long utilised violence as a means to challenge state authority, from the Tamil Tigers' campaigns against Sri Lankan government To the FARC, the guerrillas, action against the Colombian state. Violence has been a recurring theme as the designation of such groups as terrorists. The perceived legitimacy of such groups can be enhanced if they are fighting particularly representative governments or if they avoid civilian targets. Ultimately, they need to have widespread support in order to succeed. They need to be defending or fighting for a particular constituency or group that has been disenfranchised or marginalised. The distinction between liberation movements and terrorist groups is a problematic one, but legitimacy is key in maintaining a group's ability to function and challenge the state through violence. Despite the ideas of many terrorist groups in seeking change, they often lack widespread popular support in the same way that certain revelations in insurgencies might. To this end, terrorist groups often adopt extreme tactics as part of a violent theatre, Law 2009, page 3, to draw attention to their cause and in the hope of provoking a disproportionate reaction by those whom they target to further help their cause. In many ways, terrorist acts are symbolic acts that employ violence as a means of generating both fear and fame. You can see already that we have not attempted a precise definition of terrorism here. Rather, we have emphasised some common traits of terrorist activity. Terrorism, and even the idea of a terrorist, is a contest term because of the problem of legitimacy. The point at which an action becomes legitimate is subjective and open to dispute. By and large, most people would assume a difficult position of being against acts of political violence if they target innocent civilians. However, that has not stopped groups that were once deemed as terrorists from garnering wider support at a later date. Terrorist groups and/or actions are more likely to succeed when their case is deemed legitimate by a wider audience. Similarly, a heavy-handed or disproportionate response by states to such acts may also serve to legitimise terrorist groups. Kiras 2021. States will regularly use the terrorist label as a means of legitimising certain actions, a trend that has arguably increased since the onset of the US-led war on terrorism. Some attempts have been made at giving an overarching definition of the term terrorism. For example, in 2005, the United Nations proposed to define terrorism as something that involved any act intended to intimidate a population or to compel a government or an international body to act, and constitute one of the most serious threats to international peace and security, United Nations. However, in 2006, the 192 UN member states failed to agree on this formal definition. This was largely because of disagreements among members on whether a definition should encompass armed conflicts that take place in situations of foreign occupation. Studying terrorism as an issue in global politics is not without difficulty. The discourse around terrorism, primarily in the media, but also in some parts of academia, is at times highly emotive, ranging from prescriptions on what needs to be done to outright panic. This chapter does not seek to make any subjective judgment. Rather, the aim is to give you critical understanding of the contested idea of terrorism and terrorist groups as non-state actors, and an insight into how it is changing as such. It will first examine the development of modern terrorism, looking at the distinct types or waves in this phenomenon that can be discerned from the 19th century to the present day. It will then move on to explore the relationship between terrorism and globalisation, focus on the role of networks in shaping our understanding of terrorism in recent times. With the historical background and some explanatory approach in mind, the final section will look at a case study of a global terrorist actor in the form of Al-Qaeda, offering some interpretations of its significance to global politics and the changes that it has undergone. Modern terrorism in historical context. The first section provides some background for understanding the development of terrorism in the modern form. You have noted the term modern appearing here. As mentioned above, terrorism is a phenomenon, arguably as an old civilization itself. Although the term only came into use following the French Revolution, there are some numerous examples throughout history where groups have employed acts of violence that share many characteristics with modern terrorism. Thus, terrorist-type groups can be seen in the Roman Empire, most notably the Zealots, Sicarii, a Messianic Jewish group that instigated uprising amongst their Roman rulers in Judah and employed assassination of key political and religious figures and kidnapping as means of achieving their aims. One can also see similarities in the characteristics of the Asians, a medieval Shia Muslim group based present-day Iran but operating across the Middle East, who sought to reconstitute Islam into a single community, devoid of schism. The assassins utilised significant holy days to stage assassination of prominent figures from surrounding governments as a means of drawing attention to their cause. Both of the above are examples of a scared form of terrorist activity that draws on interpretation of religious sources. These are useful for such groups because they provide a strong moral justification for those carrying out the acts and therefore provide a sense of legitimacy, as well as see their later when looking at one of contemporary terrorist groups, Al Qaeda religion, or at least certain interpretations of it, continues to play a significant role. You might also recognise that elements of both terms used in the historical antecedents, disease and assassination, form a part of the language often used to describe terrorist actors and acts. A zealot might be thought of a fantastic or devotee of a certain creed who will be uncompromising in pursuit of their aims, which is certainly a charge that could be laid at adherents of religion based. Fundamentalist terrorist groups, similarly assassination, now widely understood as an act of deliberately killing a prominent political or public figure. It forms part of the criminalised actions of terrorist groups. Page 236. Waves of modern terrorism. While above examples show that how terrorism can be viewed as having long-standing historical precedents, it is widely agreed that terrorism is not in its modern, recognisable form made in its first appearance in the late 19th century. Rapoport outlined the development of modern terrorism in four waves, which run chronically from the late 19th century to the present day. The four waves can be identified as follows: anarchists from the 1880s onwards, anti-colonial beginning at 1920s, left-wing, what Report describes as New Left, the late 1960s, religious from the 1979. This is not the only way of identifying phase in development of what we now understand as terrorism, and we can certainly discern sub-strands within each wave, but they provide a neat, chronological overview of the phenomenon and its development. The first wave, anarchist terrorism. The roots of modern terrorism can be seen in anarchist thinking of the 19th century. They created a strategy of the doctrine for terror. This is not a quite of all anarchist thinking with political violence. Indeed, many anarchists abhor violence, but what they have in common is an antipathy to the authority of the state. Russian writers campaigned against the perceived violence of the imperial destiny in their country. At a time, they were crucial in formulating these ideas, promoting repeated acts of violence against the ruling regime in order to polarize society and foment revolution. This was facilitated by the developments in transport and communication in the late 19th century, such as the flourishing of mass newspapers, railways, and the telegraph. These rebels described themselves as terrorists, drawing their lineage from the French Revolution. The tactics were exported from Russia across Europe, culminating in the golden age of assassination. Rapoport 2004, which saw the targeted killings of prominent political figures and monarchs by assassins who would move easily across the porous international borders of Europe at the time. Here we can paint to the Italian assassins that killed a string of European royals at the end of the 19th century and the Republican exile group. The terrorist brigade establishing its headquarters in Switzerland, from where activities were coordinated across Europe. Thus, we have the first instance of what we now refer to as international terrorism. Burley notes that anarchist terrorists ultimately undermine their cause, however, stating that a philosophy, anarchism, which regards the state as nothing more than an organisation of violence on behalf of vested interests, come to be universally identified with murderous violence, liberating the more harmless aspects of the underlying philosophy. The assassination of key political figures was to continue into the early 20th century and ultimately can be seen as the setting of the stage for one of its most brutal conflicts, the First World War, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a group of assassins campaigning against Austro-Hungarian war of the Balkans. Second wave anti-colonial terrorism. Rapoport identifies the second wave as being precipitated by the Treaty of Versailles, which concluded hostilities in the First World War. This treaty applied the principle of self-determination to break up the empires of defeated states, but in doing so undermining the legitimacy of the Allies' own imperial possessions. Thus, in Ireland, there was a campaign for independence from Britain, and also a refusal from some factions there to accept Britain's remaining hold on Northern Ireland. In Cyprus, the Eoka sought to unify the island with Greece, despite the presence of the Turkish minority, who did not wish to do so. In what was to become a state of Israel, the Menachem, the Beijing's Ergun movement sought to establish total Jewish control over what is the British Mandate, Palestine. In all three instances, newly independent states were to emerge following the Second World War. It's something that can be conceived as terrorist activity or a struggle for liberation. It was crucial in their formation as independent states. The case of Algeria also provides an interesting illustration of the anti-colonial flavour of this wave. Demand for independence from France resulted in a war that pitted France and its supporters in Algeria against the Algerian Front de Liberation Nationale. The FLN were ultimately successful in securing independence for Algeria in 1962. However, this in turn led to the founding of the organisation, the Army Secret, OAS, by French colonial settlers or colons who carried out terrorist attacks against French political figures in both Algeria and France. It is an attempt to prevent Algeria's independence. There was a recognition among groups operating in the anti-colonial wave that the designation terrorists now had negative connotations, and thus they were framed as liberation groups, or, in the words of Begin, freedom fighters. Thus, we return to our initial point regarding the problems of definition that we were outlining in the introduction. Tactics were also changed from those of the first wave, the groups targeting police and army units, and attempts to avoid wider civilian casualties. There was further success for anti-colonial struggles following the end of the Second World War, when the now superpower US pressed for the elimination of colonial empires. As such, there was a major wave of decolonisation of the European powers from their empires. This period saw wars of independence in French Indochina, consisting of the modern-day states of Colombia, Laos, and Vietnam, and in Indonesia as it sought independence from the Dutch colonial rule. The founding of the UN also helped legitimise the struggles that were chafing against the remnants of the colonial empires around the world, as it had a principle of self-determination as its core. As we have seen in the introduction, however, the UN is an organisation that still cannot formulate a unified position in differentiating between struggles against foreign occupation and terrorism. The third wave, left-wing terrorism. The third wave, which Rapoport describes as a new left, was stimulated by the US continued involvement in the Vietnam War and dissatisfaction among the youths in the West about the war and ambivalence towards a system that governed them. With Soviet backing, groups such as the West German Red Army faction, also known as the Baader Meinhof Gang, and the Italian Red Brigades, cautiously referred by the Burley 2009 as the guilty white kids, sought to act as vanguards from the oppressed masses of the Third World. Their new left designation should be widely equated with the new left movement you encountered in Block 3. However, groups such as those mentioned above were very much on the extremities of the new left movement. It should also be noted that not all terrorist acts in this period were the work of leftist groups. In Italy, for example, despite the prominence of groups such as the Red Brigades, fascist groups were just as active in the so-called years of lead. That regular assassination bombings across the country. I'm going to leave that there, page 240. Oh, 240. Not bad, not bad. Do me happy with that. On a good day, we should get it done tomorrow.